אנו מכריזים בזאת
Hi, I'm Barry Shaw, and this is The View from Israel on behalf of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies. I want to share with you some of the heavy clouds hanging over Israel. One big cloud is the current United States administration and where it stands or doesn't stand with Israel. To help me, I'm going to throw some questions at a friend of the show, former Brigadier General and founder of Habitchonistim, a movement of leading IDF officers advocating for Israel's future security needs, Amir Avivi.
Hello, Barry. Happy to be
Thanks for joining me today, Amir. Some time ago, you paid a visit to the United States, Washington, D.C. Tell us who you met there. What was your point in your mission to go there? What message did you want to bring to the United States administration?
Well, when we went to Washington, it was mainly two main issues. One, it was the Iranian deal. We are very, very worried about the fact that the U.S. is moving towards a terrible deal with the Iranians, wanting to lift the sanctions, wanting to move forward with a deal that basically gives the Iranian, within a few years, the capability to have endless amounts of nuclear weapons. This, of course, is a threat that is existential for the state of Israel, and it's not only a threat for Israel. This is a threat to the whole Middle East. It's a threat to the world. The Iranians are operating not only in the Middle East, they're operating in Africa, they're operating in the backyard of the US, in Venezuela. This is a kind of new Cuba that is emerging with the help of the Iranians. And we see the US today and the world, how strongly they're able to impose sanctions on the Russians. And yet, when we look at Iran, that is far, far more dangerous than the Russians in many ways, we see the Western world completely surrendering to the Iranians. And this is troubling. We feel in Israel that our future is in our hands. We are the ones that have to get ready and deal with this huge threat, even if it means a big war. And we don't feel that we have the back of the US and the Western world in this dangerous situation.
Mia, I want to share with our viewers some information that I came onto just a couple of days ago, and it's very, very serious indeed. The negotiation going on in the hotel in Vienna, that in fact there has been COVID direct negotiations going on between the United States and Iran outside of the hotel, if you like. I just want to remind our viewers that the head of the United States negotiation team is a man called Rob Malley. And what has happened with the Rob Malley's team is that at least 4 of his deputies there have walked away from the negotiations. And one of them, a man called Gabriel Noronha, actually gave out some very important information that the public doesn't know about what's going on. And quite frankly, it leads to one conclusion. But let me just give you just some of the items, and it's part of a 6-page document that I have here. And listeners, viewers, make note of this. What has been taken off the restrictions on Iran is that some of the worst people you can imagine will have sanctions lifted off them. One of them is a man called Mohsen Raziei, who was involved in the 1994 bombing of the Jewish center in Argentina that killed 85 people. He will be able to live free of sanctions if Mali's release of the sanctions on that person is released. More up to date, another person who will be lifted from the sanctions is Iranian Revolutionary Guard Brigadier General, your rank, Amir, Hossein Dagan, who led the Iranian revolutionary forces in Lebanon and Syria, where Hezbollah bombed the marine compound in Beirut that killed 241 American servicemen, and yet Mali is lifting this man from sanctions, part of the original Iran deal. So you can see if America isn't really keeping sanctions on people that killed hundreds of their own servicemen, how are they going to really depend on them to protect us? And another one, Ali Akbar Veilati, who is a supreme leader, he was in charge of the homicide mission, the mission for the attack on the Jewish center in Argentina. And he is the ideological mastermind of people like the Ayatollahs and the spread of the Iranian arm throughout the Middle East. These sort of people are involved, are being lifted of the sanctions. Another part is part of the sanctions, cutting to the short, quite frankly. The bank accounts that have been frozen sanctions will be lifted from them because, according to Murray, this is not part of the negotiation, the nuclear negotiations. So what's going to happen is that also Iran is going to be free from the oil sanctions. And Iran, who are under the pressure of the Trump sanctions and hurting economically and preventing them from taking the widespread actions they were wanting to take over the last few years, will be rewarded by billions of dollars. And most of those monies will be going to develop their ballistic missile program, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Program, and rewarding not only their Revolutionary Guard, but their proxies throughout the Middle East, who are terrorizing both Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, from all sorts of places, including from Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And these people will be given more arms and more sophisticated weapons in order to attack us. But according to the Biden administration negotiation tactics and strategies, this is outside the framework of a nuclear agreement. So we can see when we hear voices coming from whether it's our Prime Minister Bennett or from our Foreign Minister Lapid that this is a bad deal, worse than the first deal. They're not going into details, but it's very important for our viewers to be appraised of what some of the conditions of this are. Do you have any comments on that so far, Amir?
So the Iranians have a strategic goal. They want to build an army of rockets, missiles, and UAVs, the size of between 250,000 to 300,000 around Israel, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in the Iraq, and in Iran. And once they feel this big power they are building will be ready, they will attack Israel. Now, this attack can occur in 2 or 3 different scenarios. One is that they feel ready and they attack. The other possibility is that because we are left alone and we need to prepare for attacking the nuclear installations of Iran, it's obvious that once we have no choice and we have to destroy these capabilities in order to exist, they will utilize all of their militias around us and will shoot at Israel. So obviously, the lifting the sanctions and giving the Iranians billions and billions of dollars will result in investing this money as they did till now in their militias, accelerating dramatically these capabilities. And this might bring us in 1 year to a war we haven't seen like since the Yom Kippur War. And basically, it means that this policy of the US and Europe are endangering Israel existentially. And even if the Iranians don't achieve nuclear capabilities, they still can operate this huge army. The Iranians are not only affecting what is going on around Israel, they are mobilizing inside Israel all the jihadist elements. We saw it in the last operation in Gaza, the ability of the Hamas, with terror organization and Iranian militia funded by Iran, guided by Iran. We saw Hamas being able to mobilize Israeli Arabs and Palestinians in Judea and Samaria to attack Jews all over the country, in Yafo, in Acre, in Jerusalem, and so on, in Lod, Beersheba, and this reality might bring us to a war where we face two main things. One is a huge attack of rockets and missiles, tens of thousands every day, from all over the Middle East. And the other thing is an uprisal inside Israel. Now, Israel is preparing, but not fast enough. One of the main messages we are conveying to the government and to the defense establishment, there's a huge change in the world. We need to move much, much faster. Israel needs to invest huge investment, short period of time in the army and in the police to be ready to deal with this huge threat. And also, we cannot sit and just wait for this to happen. We need to be proactive, just as we did in the Six-Day War. Israel needs to go back to being a player that is proactive and influences its own future, and not just wait for the Iranians to be ready. So I would say that at the moment, the fact that the Russians understand that what America is doing is basically replacing Russian oil and gas with the Iranian oil and gas. This is why they're stopping at the moment this agreement. For us, it's good news. And we see how it goes. We don't know exactly what will happen, but we hope that the Russians are starting to understand that lifting sanctions from the Iranians is a very bad deal for them as well, for their own reasons, and maybe this will stop. But having said that, even if the deal doesn't move forward, the Iranians are moving forward. They learned from what happened to Libya. They saw Libya giving up their nuclear capabilities, and following that, NATO destroyed Libya. And Libya today is not a state. We saw Ukraine giving up their nuclear capabilities with many promises that NATO and the US will defend them. And we see the reality Ukraine is facing. There is a good chance that at least in East Ukraine will cease to exist. And the Russians are getting ready to conquer all of the cities in the east of Ukraine, from the line of Kiev, Odessa, and east. And this is a country who gave up strategic capabilities, trusting the West, and now the West is not willing to fight for them. So Iran is watching this. It's also watching North Korea, a country that has nuclear capabilities, and nobody wants to deal with them. So the Iranians understand that if they want this, their government to continue to control Iran and thrive, they need nuclear capabilities, and they are not going to give this up. There is no piece of paper that is going to take the Iranians out of their plan to reach nuclear military capabilities. And therefore, the only way to deal with this at this stage is being willing to destroy these capabilities, just as we did in Iraq at the time, and just as we did in Syria. And in those places where the nuclear capability was destroyed by military means, there was no building back of these capabilities. Now, this is not a private problem of Israel. This is a global problem, and we expect the US and we expect the Europeans to understand that and be willing, if they are not willing to confront the Russians, at least be willing to confront Iran and help destroy these capabilities while imposing huge sanctions on them. It's amazing that Iran, that endangers the whole Middle East and endangers the world and treats its people in the worst way possible, killing people, hanging people, persecuting people, and yet the free world is willing, just in order to make some money and have some trade with the Iranians, to basically sell out the Iranian people and also all the Middle East, including Israel, just for the sake of commerce and economy. And this is not the way we expect the free world, the West world, the democracies to behave. And it's sad that this is the situation. But I think there is a deep understanding in Israel that this is what is happening, and we need to take our future in our own hands and get ready to retaliate and do what we need to do.
But I woke up this morning to this headline that the United States have rejected Poland's request or acceptance to give the Ukrainians the planes that they could win the war with. In other words, they're being sent to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. The reason this is so troubling to me is because I believe that our requests of the United States, both in the past and now, to be supplied with certain equipment, bunker-busting bombs, for instance, so that if we have to take steps to destroy the nuclear missiles, like you mentioned that we've done in Iraq and in Syria, that the United States are refusing to give us the tools to do the job. What light can you show on that?
I want to explain, first of all, what's the way things are happening in Ukraine. The US said from the very beginning that they are not going to get involved militarily in Ukraine. Now, the West, for many, many years, started believing that human nature changed, that if you bring democracy and bring the new technology, basically we are developing to a world with no wars. And under this assumption, the countries, especially in Europe, have almost stopped completely investing in armies by thinking that if you don't invest in armies and you don't have armies, you don't have wars. But not all the cultures in the world think like that. And the Russians, although they don't have such a big economy, they build a huge, huge army. Just talking about tanks, and they have many other capabilities, but they have like 12,000 tanks. Germany, a country like Germany, has 50 active tanks. A country like Britain, this not long ago empire where the sun never went down, has 150 tanks. And this is, of course, no match to the Russian power. And once the Russians showed that nothing has changed in the world and human beings are human beings, and they are willing to fight for what they believe, and there are different ideologies and so on. At the moment, the West is in a state of shock, without an ability to really do something meaningful. Even the US, being a big army, they don't have these forces now in Europe to stop anything. So they need to be very, very careful in the way they handle themselves at the moment with the Russians. They view Putin as somebody they don't know how he will behave. They didn't see this huge change, although Russia did the first step already in Crimea. This is why the US is very careful in what they are doing, talking about meaningful weapons that might change the whole picture. Now, talking about Israel, of course, the U.S. is an ally of Israel, and we always need to seek to strengthen this relationship. We can have good relations, but Israel cannot rely anymore on U.S. Assistance. We need to be able to be more free to purchase also from other countries and develop other relationships. The world is changing. Israel needs to invest more in the Israeli industries. We need all the most crucial munitions to be developed in Israel. We must enhance our capability to defend ourselves by ourselves, and this doesn't mean that we don't have a strategic alliance with the US. We're talking about the heart of our national security. And this is why this is so crucial and so important that we figure this out and we find the right balance.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right what you talk about. As far as my figures are concerned, I may be wrong on this, but I think that, for instance, European countries up till fairly recently were spending like 2% of their economy on their security and defense.
We are spending 5% of our GDP, okay? Much like the US. By the way, for many years, I mean, there is a difference how much is the spending compared to the GDP and how much is it from the overall budget. It's two different numbers. But usually the way it's measured is percentage from GDP. In Israel, it went all the way down to 5%, and now it's even a bit less. For many years, for the last decade, the government kept the same budget in shekels year after year, but at the same time, the economy grew dramatically. So obviously, this same budget as part of the GDP is going down and down. And I think that even Israel, in this sense, has crossed the line, and especially talking about what's happening now, this huge change and the need to get ready to this coming future, Israel will have to take, in my view, a substantial amount of money, grow the budget of the military at least in the coming 2-3 years, at least in 20%, and get the army ready for what we need, and also the police for what we need to face the coming challenges that we might face. Now, if we are strong enough, if you don't want war, there's only one thing you need to do: be strong. If you are not strong, just as Europe is now, it's just a matter of time until somebody sees that and seizes the moment and changes the balance of power in the world. People are trying to believe or create a world without changes, that everything is frozen. This is not the way the world works. The world is all the time a fight for power between different nations and entities. And the moment you get weak, somebody will take advantage of that. And we certainly cannot afford to be weak.
Well, you're right, because what we're seeing, Amir, is actually the wars between the democracy on the one hand and dictators and tyrants on the other. And if the democratic world is not prepared to stand up for a democratic country under attack, where is it going to draw the line? Amir, I want to give you another example on the question of can Israel rely on the United States? Ukraine a few years ago surrendered their nuclear capability on a commitment, on a signed commitment by Russia, Britain, and the United States that if anybody attacked Ukraine, that these countries will come in to defend Ukraine's rights for self-preservation in any such war. And here we have a situation where they surrendered their nuclear capability, and now Russia has imposed this brutal war on them. And how can we rely on the United States for any commitment in any nuclear deal when push comes to shove?
Well, I refer to it not only talking about the nuclear deal. Look, we are a nation that for 2,000 years have been at the mercy of the nations. Anywhere Jews went, we brought prosperity to the place, and yet we were all the time persecuted all along our history. And in the last years of the diaspora, we had 6 million Jews being killed in concentration camp on European soil. So the Jewish people, I think, cannot afford any war anymore to depend on anybody. We need to be able to defend ourselves by ourselves. Of course, we need alliances. Of course, we need a good relationship with the US, but there is a big, big difference between having common interests, common values, alliances, between putting your future in the hands of somebody else. If Israel wants to thrive, it needs to exist along secure borders, meaning the Golan Heights, the Jordan Valley. It needs to be in full control of Judea and Samaria, talking about our security, and for that we need massive presence of Jews. This doesn't mean that the Palestinians cannot govern themselves, as they do. There are many interesting and good solutions for this issue. But Israel cannot put anything that has to do with its national security in the hands of another nation. No paper can guarantee our future. Only we can guarantee our future by defending ourselves. In the US, politics change. There is one administration now. We don't know what will happen in November in the midterms, and we certainly don't know what will happen in 2 years. And we have no idea what will happen in the next coming decades. So the only way to deal with the future that is unknown is making sure that you hold the cards for your own security and prosperity. And this is what Israel needs to do. We are a strong country, we're a growing power, we have a strong economy and a strong society. We need to invest in strengthening our Jewish Zionist values. This is the basic thing for any future in our land. And we need to keep our swords sharp for any possible outcome in the future. And I must say, the stronger we are, the bigger are the chances for peace. The reason why Sunni Arab countries are signing peace agreements with Israel, it's not because we are weak, it's because we are strong. Because they understand it's worthwhile for them to be in good relationship with us, that they can rely on us assisting them against the huge threat of Iran. I think that anybody who looks at what's going on now, this huge war in Europe, can understand why wars are still happening and that human nature hasn't really changed. And what was will be. The world has known 1,000 years of wars, and it will know wars in the future as well. And this is something we need to understand and we need to get ready for. And when looking especially at the Middle East, there is not many things that I can say that are going the right direction in the Middle East. The withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan is really empowering all the radical Sunni elements. We see again attacks of ISIS in Syria. We see ISIS getting stronger again in the Sinai Peninsula. We see Afghanistan being controlled by forces who are extreme and radical. And at the same time, we see the Shia powers. We see Iran moving towards nuclear capabilities, building very strong militias in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and also extending their capabilities to the northern part of Africa. And this is the reality. I mean, this reality in this tough neighborhood, Israel must be strong and be able to defend itself by itself while keeping good relations with the powers of the world and certainly with the US. But there is a difference between good relations and common interest and being dependent. Israel should not be dependent on anybody.
Amir, I've got a couple of questions for you about our relationships with the United States. On my first one in particular, actually both of them, you're the right person to ask. Israel is in a unique position because we are now a member of CENTCOM, the American Central Command. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we're the only country to be in this position. Why is this beneficial to the United States? What's in it for Israel? And what's our role there?
Well, it's beneficial for Israel and for the US because it enables much better coordination between us and the Sunni Arab countries when we're talking about countering Iran. Now, we might be very unhappy about how this current administration is dealing with Iran, but things might change, even in this administration and maybe in the next one. So having good coordination in the Middle East, being able to plan together, to train together, to assess the situation together is good news. And I hope that the moment will come where this potential will come about and we deal in a decisive way with the Iranian threat, both with the US and our allies in the Middle East, in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia. I think that at least we in the Middle East understand that this is what is needed. And we really, really need the US to come to its senses and understand how dangerous the Iranian regime is for the world and certainly for the Middle East.
A personal, professional question with regard to our role in CENTCOM. Is the intelligence involved, the military intelligence involved in this? Because the reason I'm asking, because it seems to me that if we're talking about Iran, for instance, that we seem far more capable of giving the United States intelligence of what's going on inside Iran when it comes to their nuclear program, as one example, than the Americans give us.
But I personally have not yet given completely up the notion that maybe something will change and America will come to its senses and we will coordinate something serious and not just have to do it by ourselves. But if we need to do it by ourselves, it's not only the issue of really operating with the Air Force and intelligence and so on, it's also being able to deal with all these militias, especially with Lebanon and Gaza. And it's something that we'll have to deal with. It will look maybe like 6-day war. The question is simple. Is the US going to be on the right side of history or not? We are going to be on the right side of history. But the question is whether the US and Europe are going to be on the right side of history. Now, I can say, maybe talking about how what is happening in Ukraine is affecting the relations of Israel with Europe. Now, Europeans understand that war is something that can be on their own soil, and this creates a situation where many of the Israeli military industries are now in touch and working with the northern countries and the eastern countries. Everybody wants now Israeli technology, know-how, weapons, and so on. So this is strengthening our relationship with many countries in Europe at the moment. Also, the fact that Europe that depends 40% of the gas to Europe is Russia. The moment they want to shrink the dependency on Russia, Israel has huge, huge amounts of gas to export. And this is also something that is going to change the importance of Israel strategically to Europe. So I'm hoping that these huge changes might bring Europe to get closer to the interests of Israel and understand how valuable Israel is to Europe at the present time.
Amir, you just reminded me on something about you mentioned about how valuable Israel is to Europe. I want to give an example here that I give when I talk to some of our supporters abroad of how valuable Israel is to the United States. There are people in the United States and some in Europe as well who are against the United States giving us so much quote military aid. Some of those actually are sitting in power right now in Washington, D.C. about reducing United States aid to Israel. I make the point, and you may want to comment on this, that in fact Israel gives back to the United States far more than we receive from the United States in military aid. I'll give you just a couple of simple examples very quickly. They give us the F-35 fighter planes, but actually what they get in return from this is our fighter pilots are their test pilots, and they improve their technology and everything in the cockpit of the F-35.
I'll tell you this, just the intelligence we are giving the US is like 5 CIA. And this is just the intelligence. The technology Israel is developing and the US is getting for free because of this military aid is far more valuable, talking about money, than this $3 billion. And I'm telling you, this is why I think that economically, I'm not talking even about the sovereignty and what it means not to be dependent on aid. Even economically speaking, giving up this aid and investing Israeli money in Israeli industries and selling our technology full price, and not only to the US, to all the world, being able to sign agreements with other countries, this would be extremely beneficial to the state of Israel. The state of Israel at this stage, I believe, shouldn't be reliant on military aid, and certainly not such a small amount of money. I mean, just in the month of January, the Treasury had 18 billion shekels surplus in the budget, when the US aid is something like 10 billion shekels. Only in January, we had 18 billion shekels surplus. Now, the government of Israel decided to invest, because of the current coalition, 50 billion shekels in the Arab society. It's a huge amount of money. If Israel can invest 50 billion shekels just in one group inside our country, it means how powerful we are economically. So I think that definitely military aid in 2022 is not the right way to, and the right kind of relationship we need, and we need a strong relationship. I am very in favor of a strong relationship with the US, but not based on aid, based on real cooperation, promoting real interests, which benefit both sides, and keep Israel strong and able to defend itself by itself. We don't expect any American soldier to fight for us. We never did. But if we are going to war, we need to be able to be as self-reliant as possible and do whatever we need, and certainly not rely just on one state in this globe. We need to have relations with many different powers in the world.
I want to thank you for sharing. I want to thank you for sharing those figures. I think it's very important that our listeners know exactly where we stand on these issues. I want to thank you, and I hope you'll be my guest going forward, because I think throughout this year, 2022, we will have other issues and we need your expertise.
Thank you, Barry. I enjoyed very much our conversation and looking forward to the next time.
Well, viewers, I started this by talking about dark clouds above Israel as we head through 2022. These won't be lifted, but we want you to know what's going on and the truth of what's going on over here. If you like this interview, please click the like button, click the subscribe button, share it with other people. It's important that our message, whether it's negative but truthful, please share it with others. This is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel. Thank you for joining me.
אנו מכריזים בזאת